All right, so let's rewind the clock a bit, way back.
Yeah.
Because today we're diving deep into the history of Ireland and England. And trust me, it's a relationship that's been anything but smooth sailing. You've given us a stack of historical accounts. And our mission is to untangle how these two islands became so intertwined, ultimately setting the stage for the Easter Rising of 1916.
You know, it's funny because so many people picture pre-English Ireland, like this tranquil, unified island, a sort of Celtic paradise. But the reality is far more complex, even turbulent.
Yeah, it's like that 800 years of oppression narrative you hear. It's just way too simple.
It really is. To really grasp this history, we have to ditch the simple narratives. We need to explore the intricate tapestry of Gaelic chieftains, Viking incursions, and shifting alliances that really defined early Ireland.
Okay, so
Yeah.
let's unpack that. Where do we even begin with this tangled story?
Well, imagine Ireland before the Normans. It wasn't a single unified kingdom, but a complex network of Gaelic lords, each vying for power and influence. And into this mix, you have these Viking raiders. They're establishing settlements, which further complicates the political landscape.
So, not exactly a peaceful utopia.
No, not quite. Power was fluid, alliances were constantly shifting, and conflict was a regular occurrence. Just to illustrate how intertwined things were even back then, there was a time when the King of Dublin was also the King of York.
Wow. Talk about a power couple. So how did the Normans enter this already complex picture? Because their arrival is often seen as the starting point for English dominance in Ireland, right?
It was a turning point, definitely. But even that event is more nuanced than many people realize. The Normans, led by Strongbow, Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare is his full name. They arrived in Ireland in 1169. But they weren't uninvited. They were actually invited by Diarmait Mac Murchada. He was the deposed king of Leinster, desperate to regain his throne.
So it was less of a hostile takeover and more of a strategic partnership gone wrong.
Exactly. Diarmait was playing a very dangerous game, inviting foreign powers into Ireland to help him in a local power struggle. As history often shows, these alliances can have really unintended and far-reaching consequences.
Yeah. It seems that even from the beginning, the story of English involvement in Ireland is characterized by these messy entanglements and power plays.
Yeah, it's important to understand that the Norman conquest was never complete. Gaelic lords still had a lot of power in many parts of Ireland, so it wasn't a simple case of one island completely subjugating the other.
Okay, so we're already pretty complicated here. What happens next in this historical drama?
Well, fast forward a few centuries, we arrive at the Tudor era. This is where religion really becomes a major force in Anglo-Irish relations. Enter Henry VIII. Not exactly known for subtlety, he decides to change his title from Lord of Ireland to King of Ireland, which asserts a much more direct English claim to the island.
And this move coincides with the English Reformation, right? So now we've got this added layer of religious tension.
Exactly, and this is a crucial point that's often overlooked. The Reformation, which swept through England and parts of Scotland, failed to really take hold in Ireland.
Why is that? What made Ireland so resistant to this religious upheaval?
There's a number of factors at play. First, Irish identity was already very much tied to Catholicism. Second, the Irish language acted as a significant barrier. Religious texts and sermons were primarily in English. And third, Ireland was far less urbanized than England, which probably slowed the spread of Protestant ideas.
So you have this growing religious divide, but it's also tied to something much more tangible, land. And this leads us to the plantations.
Yes, the plantations were a real turning point in Anglo-Irish relations, the systematic dispossession of Irish Catholic landowners, and the granting of that land to Protestant settlers from England and Scotland.
And this wasn't just a few isolated incidents, was it? This was massive.
Absolutely. Imagine this. 2/3 of Irish land changed hands. 2/3. Over 100,000 settlers arrived, really transforming the landscape, the demographic and cultural landscape of Ireland. I mean, we can't understate the impact this had.
It's mind-boggling to think about the scale of that displacement.
It really is, and it's important to remember that this wasn't just about religious zeal. The English government was also motivated by security concerns, particularly the fear of Spanish intervention in Ireland. They saw these Protestant plantations as a way to really secure their hold and create a loyal buffer against any potential Catholic threats.
So it's this complex mix of religion, power, and fear. Not exactly a recipe for peaceful coexistence.
It's not, and this is all before we even get to Cromwell. and the further upheaval that he brought to Ireland.
Okay, so this is where things get even more intense. Cromwell's arrival in Ireland is a chapter often shrouded in darkness and brutality.
It is. And to really understand the full impact of his arrival, we need to go back to the 1641 rebellion in Ulster.
The one where thousands of Protestant settlers were killed.
That's the one. It was a bloody and traumatic event, no doubt. But it's important to recognize that the English accounts, often shaped by fear and prejudice, tended to really exaggerate the scale of the violence and demonize the Irish.
So you have this climate of fear and suspicion, which really lays the groundwork for Cromwell's brutal response.
Exactly. 1649, Cromwell arrives in Ireland with a vengeance, determined to crush any remaining resistance and secure English control once and for all. His actions at Drogheda and Wexford are infamous, marked by massacres and just widespread brutality.
Truly dark chapters in Irish history.
They were. And the consequences extended far beyond just those events. There was mass displacement, transportation of Irish people to the Caribbean, and a further entrenchment of these religious and cultural divides.
And so Cromwell becomes this symbol of English oppression in Irish memory.
He does, but it's crucial to remember that he was very much a product of his time. He was operating within a larger historical context of land dispossession, religious conflict, and colonial ambition. And his actions, while horrific, were really part of a larger pattern of violence and subjugation that had been going on for centuries.
So a catalyst for further suffering, but also a symptom of the deeper issues that plagued Anglo-Irish relations.
I think that's a fair assessment. Picking up where we left off, the Act of Union in 1801 really marked a new era in Anglo-Irish relations. On the surface, it aimed to create this, more integrated United Kingdom, but like we often see in history, attempts to force unity can sometimes just ignite new forms of conflict.
Almost like trying to cram mismatched puzzle pieces together, They might fit, but the picture doesn't quite make sense. What were some of the key issues that emerged after the Act of Union?
Well, despite all the promises made, during the Union's formation, Catholic emancipation remained a major point of contention. I mean, the act hinted at greater religious equality, but for many Irish Catholics, the reality fell short.
So again, we see this pattern of raised hopes and then just dashed expectations. Tell me more about this fight for emancipation. Who are the key players?
Well, one figure that really emerges during this period is Daniel O'Connell. He was this brilliant lawyer, a really captivating orator, and he really galvanized the Irish people. O'Connell used his legal expertise and his political savvy to build this powerful movement, pushing for Catholic rights.
He sounds like a force to be reckoned with.
Right.
What were some of his tactics in challenging the status quo?
Well, O'Connell really understood the power of mass mobilization.
Yeah.
He spearheaded the Catholic Association, which skillfully used petitions, public meetings, and even massive rallies to show just how much popular support there was for emancipation. Just imagine these huge gatherings, sometimes drawing hundreds of thousands of people, all united in this demand for religious equality.
That's incredible. I mean, just think about the logistics of organizing something like that back then, let alone the impact it must have had.
It really was incredible, and it was a testament to O'Connell's leadership and the depth of feeling among the Irish people, and it worked. The British government, facing this immense sustained pressure, finally relented. In 1829, Catholic emancipation was finally granted. This allowed Catholics to sit in Parliament and hold public office.
That must have been a moment of just immense triumph for O'Connell and the movement he built. But did this victory truly resolve the underlying issues, or did it simply shift the battleground?
Well, emancipation was huge, but it didn't erase the centuries of injustice, resentment, and inequality that had really built up between Ireland and England. Issues of land ownership, economic disparity, and cultural difference. They were all still there, simmering beneath the surface, fueling new movements and aspirations for greater Irish autonomy.
So we're seeing a shift in focus. It's not just about religious freedom anymore. It's about self-governance, about Ireland charting its own course.
Exactly. And this desire for greater control found expression in the Home Rule movement, which really gained a lot of traction in the late 19th century.
When we talk about Home Rule, what exactly did that entail? What were they asking for?
Well, Home Rule advocates essentially wanted to establish an Irish parliament within the United Kingdom. It would allow for a degree of self-governance, while still remaining part of the British Empire. Think of it as a sort of devolution of power, granting Ireland more control over its internal affairs.
So a potential compromise, a way to address Irish grievances without a complete break from Britain.
That was the hope, at least for some, and the movement really gained momentum, especially under the leadership of Charles Stewart Parnell.
Parnell is interesting, right? A Protestant landowner, championing Irish home rule. It seems like the lines of division weren't always neatly drawn along religious lines.
You're absolutely right. Irish nationalism was never a monolithic thing. There were always diverse perspectives, sometimes even within the same family. Parnell's leadership really highlights that. This desire for greater autonomy resonated beyond any single group. It really tapped into a deeper sense of Irish identity and this yearning for self-determination.
But as with any movement seeking significant change, I imagine home rule faced some opposition.
It did. It faced fierce resistance, especially from Ulster Protestants,
Mhm.
who really feared being marginalized. In a Catholic-majority Ireland, they saw continued union with Britain as absolutely essential to protecting their own interests, their identity, and their way of life.
So you have this parallel tension emerging within Ireland itself,
Yeah.
mirroring the larger conflict with England.
You do. And this internal division would become even more significant as we move into the 20th century, further complicating the path towards resolution.
So before we delve further into those events that led to the Easter Rising, we need to address the Great Famine, a truly tragic chapter in Irish history that cast a long shadow over Anglo-Irish relations.
It did. The Great Famine was a period of unimaginable suffering, a defining moment. That left a really deep scar on the Irish psyche. To truly grasp the magnitude of this event, we need to understand its context.
Paint the picture for us. What led to this catastrophic event?
Well, between 1845 and 1852, Ireland was struck by a devastating potato blight. This disease ravaged potato crops across the entire island, and for a population heavily reliant on potatoes, this blight had just catastrophic consequences.
So when the potato failed, it wasn't just a crop failure. It was a societal collapse in the making.
Exactly. The effects were swift and just merciless. You had widespread starvation, disease, and death. It gripped the land, and it's estimated that over 1 million people died during the famine, and another 1 million were forced to emigrate, fleeing this devastation in hopes of survival.
Those numbers are staggering. It's difficult to even fathom the scale of human suffering during those years. How did the British government, then in control of Ireland, respond to this unfolding crisis?
The British response to the famine, it's still a very contentious issue today. While there were some relief efforts, they were often inadequate, poorly managed, and lacking compassion, and many Irish people felt completely abandoned by the authorities, left to fend for themselves in the face of unimaginable hardship.
So you have this devastating famine, coupled with a perceived indifference, or even negligence on the part of the British government. How did this shape Irish attitudes towards England?
It's not hard to imagine the bitterness and resentment, that took root. The famine really became this rallying point for Irish nationalists, solidifying this belief that a break from British rule was essential for Ireland's survival and prosperity. It really was a turning point that etched itself into the memory of the Irish people and fueled this drive for self-determination for generations to come.
The stage is set. We've got deep-seated grievances, a growing sense of national identity, a burning desire for self-determination. What happens next? How do we get from the trauma of the famine to the Easter Rising?
In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we see all these different strands of Irish nationalism gaining momentum, expressing themselves through cultural revival movements, political activism, and increasingly, the belief that armed resistance might be the only path to true liberation.
So we're seeing a range of approaches emerge, some advocating for peaceful reform, and others believing that more drastic measures were necessary.
Exactly. And within this complex tapestry of aspirations and frustrations, a new generation of Irish revolutionaries start to take center stage. Figures like Patrick Pearse, James Connolly, and Constance Markievicz, each driven by their own blend of idealism and pragmatism, each convinced that a free Ireland would only be achieved through bold and decisive action.
I'm sensing a shift in tone, a growing impatience, a belief that the time for talk has passed and the moment for action has arrived.
You're right. There was a sense that peaceful means had been exhausted, that the British government would never willingly grant Ireland the freedom it craved. And this is where we see the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB, this clandestine organization dedicated to achieving Irish independence through force, come into sharper focus.
This is where the seeds of the Easter Rising are truly sown, right?
Yes, the IRB, driven by a fervent belief in armed struggle, started laying the groundwork for a rebellion, convinced that this dramatic show of force would ignite the spirit of the Irish people, and finally shatter the chains of British rule.
So we've reached a pivotal juncture. Decades of simmering tensions, political maneuvering, and unfulfilled promises, about to converge into a defining moment in Irish history.
And this brings us to the cusp of the Easter Rising, an event that would shake the foundations of Anglo-Irish relations, a rebellion that would forever alter the course of both nations.
So we've traced these tangled threads of Irish history, the rebellions, the famine, the broken promises, and now it feels like we've arrived at a point of no return. The Easter Rising.
Yeah, you could definitely say that. The Easter Rising wasn't just this, isolated outburst. It was the culmination of centuries of tension, this yearning for self-determination that we've been talking about.
Yeah. We've talked about all the lead up, the failed rebellions, broken promises, the devastating famines. Like all these events created a powder keg, just waiting for that spark.
And that spark came on Easter Monday, 1916. A group of Irish rebels, led by the figures we've discussed like Patrick Pearse, James Connolly, Constance Markievicz, they seized key locations in Dublin, including the General Post Office, standing defiantly amidst the chaos. They proclaimed the birth of the Irish Republic.
It's hard to imagine the audacity of that moment, this
Right.
small group of revolutionaries challenging the might of the British Empire. What were they hoping to achieve?
Their goal was full independence. They envisioned an Ireland free from British rule, a nation where Irish culture and identity could truly flourish. They were driven by idealism, patriotism, and a conviction that armed struggle was the only path to liberation.
And it wasn't just a fight for political independence, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about cultural identity. How did that factor into their motivations?
Well, the leaders of the Rising were deeply invested in this Irish cultural revival that was sweeping the nation, reclaiming and celebrating Irish language, literature, music, and tradition. They saw political independence as tied to this cultural revival. It was a way to, restore the soul of Ireland.
So they weren't just fighting for a change in government. They were fighting for the soul of a nation.
Yeah,
It makes their actions all the more powerful, right?
absolutely. And that vision of a revived and independent Ireland is so beautifully articulated in the proclamation of the Irish Republic. This document, read aloud by Patrick Pearse outside the General Post Office, declared Ireland a sovereign and independent nation, free from British rule. It was a moment charged with defiance, a bold statement.
Yeah. It must have been electrifying for those who believed in the cause. But as we know, the British Empire wasn't exactly known for its tolerance of rebellion. So how did they respond?
Well, the British response was swift and brutal. They deployed troops and artillery, and this fierce battle ensued, turning the streets of Dublin into a war zone. Within a week, the rebellion was crushed, leaving a lot of destruction and casualties in its wake.
A short-lived victory for the rebels then. What happened to the leaders?
Well, the leaders of the Easter Rising, including Pearse, Connolly, and Markievicz, they were captured and quickly court-martialed. Several, including Pearse and Connolly, were executed by firing squad. And these executions, particularly that of Pearse, he was really seen as a visionary, a martyr for the cause, had a profound impact on public sentiment.
It's that old saying, right? The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Did their deaths, in a way, fuel the very cause they fought for?
You could definitely argue that. While the Easter Rising was a failure militarily, it had a galvanizing effect on Irish nationalism. Those who were seen by many as radicals or troublemakers were suddenly elevated to the status of heroes and patriots, their sacrifice inspiring a new wave of resistance.
A classic example of how a crushing defeat can actually lead to a movement's eventual triumph.
Exactly. The Easter Rising was a turning point. It shifted public opinion in Ireland and really propelled the nation toward independence.
How did this shift in public opinion play out in the years after the Rising?
Well, support surged for Sinn Féin, the political party dedicated to full Irish independence. They won a landslide victory in the 1918 general election, showing just how widespread that desire was for a break from British rule. But instead of taking their seats in the British Parliament, they established their own parliament in Dublin, Dáil Éireann. It was a bold statement.
Yeah, they were putting their money where their mouth was, creating a parallel government, a direct challenge to British authority.
And this act of defiance sparked the Irish War of Independence, this guerrilla conflict that raged from 1919 to 1921 between the IRA and British forces.
A full-blown war for independence. How did it end?
It was brutal, a lot of bloodshed. Both sides had moments of heroism and tragedy. In 1921, a truce was declared, and this paved the way for negotiations. That resulted in the Anglo-Irish Treaty.
So after centuries of conflict, they finally found a path to peace.
Well, the treaty granted Ireland Dominion status within the British Commonwealth. Similar to Canada or Australia, it meant a significant degree of self-governance, but it wasn't the fully independent republic that many had fought and died for.
A compromise, then. One that brought an end to the war. but may have created new division.
Yeah. The treaty was incredibly divisive, and it actually led to a civil war in Ireland between those who supported the treaty and those who opposed it, who felt it betrayed the ideals of the Easter Rising. This conflict further fractured the nation, leaving lasting scars.
Even in victory, the path forward was complex and painful.
That's often the way with revolutions. The birth of a nation is rarely clean and straightforward. But despite these challenges, the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922 was a turning point that really altered the relationship between Ireland and England.
We've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive today, from the ancient sagas of Gaelic chieftains to the brutal realities of conquest and rebellion, from the heart-wrenching tragedy of the Great Famine to the hard-won triumph of independence. What does it all mean for us today, looking back at these events?
I think the key takeaway is that history is never simple. It's rarely a straightforward narrative of good guys and bad guys. It's messy, it's complex, woven from countless stories, motivations, and actions, often shaped by things we can't control.
And in the case of Ireland and England, it's a reminder that these two islands are bound together by a shared past, both glorious and tragic, a past that continues to shape them today.
Exactly. Understanding this history, grappling with its complexities, acknowledging the injustices and the triumphs, it's essential to moving forward, to building a future based on respect and understanding.
Well, we've certainly delved deep today. It's always fascinating how events from centuries ago can continue to shape the world.
It's a reminder that our choices and actions can have consequences that ripple through time.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to leave our listeners with a question to ponder. We've explored the many factors that led to the Easter Rising: religious divisions, land dispossession, economic inequality, cultural oppression, the desire for self-determination. What do you think played the most significant role? Was it one single thing, or was it the combination of everything?
That's a great question. There's no easy answer. Historians are still debating it today. But the important thing is to think about it, to wrestle with these complexities, and appreciate how these nuances shape the world we live in.
Well said. On that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive for today. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through this fascinating chapter of history.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. We hope you found it enlightening and maybe even sparked your curiosity to explore these topics further. Until next time, keep seeking knowledge, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.